All right. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to something new. I think. I don't think I've done something like this before, but if it's something you guys like, I can do more. And that is welcome to my review of Eberron, Rising from the Last War. This is the newest. Excuse me. This is the newest core rulebook for D&D Fifth Edition. If you're not sure what a quote unquote core rulebook is, in general, books released by Wizards of the Coast will fall into one of two categories. You have adventures like Descent into Avernus is their most recent one, and then you have what are called core rulebooks, which are things like Player's Handbook, Monster Manuals, or Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, things like that, where they will actually add things that you can use in the game, either as a player or as a dungeon master, whereas the adventures are an actual adventure you can run. Now, a lot of adventures will have extra stuff, like the Elemental Evil one that, for the life of me, I can't remember the actual title of it. But it added some new spells and I believe a new race or two. Adventures can have things that you can actually use to play the game, and they will almost always have monster stat blocks or things specific to that adventure. But a core rulebook, that will be its primary focus, is giving you basically more tools for either your DM toolbox or your player toolbox. And Eberron is a distinct form of core rulebook in that it is what's called a campaign setting. We have had some pseudo campaign settings launched. There was the Magic the Gathering Ravnica, which was a campaign setting, but it was kind of loose and was more just kind of a how you can add Magic the Gathering aspects to D&D. Eberron is a campaign setting that has been around for a little while now. I believe third edition or second edition is where it first premiered. And it's been a very popular one. It's very different from what has become the kind of standard campaign setting for D&D, which is the Forgotten Realms, which is a high fantasy, somewhat dark fantasy in places thing. You know, it's medieval technology and lots of magic and sword and sorcery kind of stuff. Eberron is much more steampunk-ish. If you're not familiar with steampunk, it's kind of like 1800s, late 1800s style technology. A lot of things are steam powered, and it has a very distinct look. Eberron is kind of a combination of the magic of the Forgotten Realms with steampunk aesthetics. So it's a really unique system. It and the and the actual campaign setting book is brilliant. To be 100% blunt, I will say I've not read absolutely everything in it yet, because the setting itself is I'll look. It's 320 pages, the book, And while there's a ton of amazing artwork in here, um, most of those 320 pages is just text. There's so much in this book. So I'm going to go over some of the aspects of it and some of the things I like, and we'll go from there. So the first things first, if you're wondering kind of what this is going to be like, this is the primary cover. They have an alternate cover that is beautiful, but you can only get it in a brick and mortar store. They're limited, and they're designed to be an incentive to buy it from a brick and mortar store, because Wizards of the Coast in general is actually really supportive of local gaming stores, as much as they can be. I have just the regular cover, and you can see you've got what looks like a halfling here with like a boomerang and this really wicked scimitar, and then you have a robot. That's what's called a warforged. They are a race that is actually specific to Eberron. A large portion of Eberron's history is based on the creation of the Warforged and what's called the Last War, which is rising from the Last War. Most Eberron settings since it began happened shortly after this event called the Last War, which was this major continent-spanning war that broke up the kingdom that was there. And one of the things that was used in the battle were these warforged. They were these magic constructed robots, and they were an entire race of people that were built and designed for this war. And after the war was over, the warforged still exist. They didn't just get turned off like weapons of war. They have sentience. They're actual living beings. And so the Warforged specifically have to kind of deal with this fact that they were created for a purpose that doesn't exist anymore. They're created as weapons of war, and now they have to try and eke out an existence without their primary purpose. And so that's a really interesting aspect of Eberron itself, is this idea that the Last War lasted a very long time and changed the face of the world. And so everything in Eberron is based on this idea of we have to now move on from the darkest part of our history, and we have to figure out where we all fit in. Whether your character actually fought in the Last War, whether they were born long after it, the entire world has to change their focus from let's see who's going to live through this war to let's try and get society to move on. And it's an overarching theme that you see over and over in the book. The first thing I want to mention about the book, like I said, it is very... it is a long source book. The last source book I actually purchased was the Sword Coast Adventurers Guide, which I was a little underwhelmed at first because I bought it for the additional class options. I wasn't treating it as a campaign setting. I was treating it as just another source book, another core rule book, for me to have more player options. And if that was all you were looking at it for, it was a little underwhelming. There wasn't that many subclasses in it. But when you treat it as a campaign setting to run campaigns on the Sword Coast and to get a lot of information about the Forgotten Realms in general, it's brilliant, but it's relatively short. It's maybe a third of this one size-wise, and it was brilliant. I thought it was worth every penny just because of how much information is in. But when you compare it to something like this blows it out of the water. There's so much info, and a lot of people might actually miss, I think, one of the best parts of this book, which is the Welcome to Eberron section. This is actually before chapter 1. It's from pages 4 to 17. And it's really great. It gives you an idea of the overall feeling of Eberron itself, and it actually goes into the Last War and gives you a brief overview of the Last War itself, its impact. It's a really important part of this book. If you don't read anything else in this book but those, 12 pages, you will still get a lot from this book, because those 12 pages will help you prepare to play in any Eberron setting campaign you go into, because there's just so much there. Now, from there, it goes into crazy amounts of stuff. One of the unique things about this is this is the first time since 5th edition launched, I think 4 or 5 years ago, that they've added a new class. In earlier editions, 4th edition, 3rd edition, 2nd edition, not so much second, they did what were called kits more than classes. But 3rd and 4th, every new supplement came with at least 1 or 2 new classes. 4th edition actually had 3 different player's handbooks. I've got, I think, the player's handbook 2, and I might have the first one too. I'd have to look. They had 3 different player's handbooks, each with a dozen or so classes in them, and then they would introduce more classes. 3rd edition had so many classes it was mind-boggling, and they had prestige classes, and it was crazy. Pathfinder has dozens and dozens of classes. So the idea that 5th edition took 4 or 5 years to add their first new class is a big deal. Now, part of that is because their subclass system allowed them to have all these things in the same class, but played differently and enough that you had so much variety that most of the classes from previous editions could be created using a subclass, and the classes themselves were so different. Back is itching. That you really adding a new class, you would have to have a class that could do something that no other class could do, and they had covered their bases really well. As far as just the myriad things that you could do. So, let's talk about character creation. That's chapter 1, and the probably the biggest thing that the book does is, or not the biggest thing, but one of the big parts of the book is it adds a lot of new options for playing a character in a Eberron campaign. For character creation, it officially adds a bunch of races that were previously just unearthed arcana, which are the changeling, the shifters, and the warforged. And I think the Kalishtar technically are a race, but they're very similar. If I'm going to look it up before I talk out of my ass. I believe they're kind of a Genasi type elemental. No, they are very different. They're kind of these creatures that are two beings in one, where they have a spirit that kind of possesses them. Um, but yeah, so they add bunch of new races. They also list the traditional races you see in the player's handbook, like Dragonborn and dwarves and elves. But they give them a place in Eberron, because we're again the PHB is written under the idea that you're playing in the Forgotten Realms, the Nentir Vale, something very similar to that. And Eberron is such a different experience that they have to kind of put these races in place um, to kind of give you this idea of how they fit into this new world. And from what I read, there's not a ton of change from what was in Unearthed Arcana to what you have in this book. I believe there's a few modifications, some slight balancing things, a few things rewritten for clarity. But for the most part, if you've been playing an Unearthed Arcana variant of these races, this should feel very, very familiar to you, and you'd have very little changes, if any at all, for most of them. So that's great. However, the real kind of game changer, and this I'm actually not sure if there was an Unearthed Arcana for this, but they have what are called the dragon marks in this. The dragon marks are an Eberron thing where there are at least 12 or 13 houses. Basically just noble houses like you would see in a oh, wow, brain just went away. Like you'd see in any sort of feudal society where you'd have a house and it has its line. This is a little bit more along the kind of Eastern Asian kind of houses that you would see maybe in the Romance of Three Kingdoms, where it's just kind of just lineage. And each house has their own kind of specialty. During the last war, they actually didn't, the houses themselves didn't fight in the last war. They remained neutral to all parties. And so because of that, they are the only kind of remnant of the previous kingdoms that live and still exist in Eberron. And because of that, they're a big deal. But one of the things they have is certain blood members of the house. You don't actually have to be related to someone to be in their house, but they do have a bloodline. And so certain blood members will have what's called a dragon mark, which is basically kind of a birthmark you're born with that has arcane properties that somehow relate to the house itself and what their specific purposes. There are dragon marks that make you stealthier, that help the espionage-based house perform espionage. Each one is really unique, and the way that they add it in previous editions, dragon marks were a thing, but they were generally like a feat. You would take a feat and it would give you a dragon mark. And there's an aspect I'll talk about in a second where you can do that in here. However, these dragon marks that are listed here in the beginning, they're actually a sub-race. Each dragon mark is limited to a race or couple races, specifically because you have to be a blood relative of the house to inherit it. It's a genetic thing. So it's humans, half-orcs, I think half-elves? Let me look at the actual thing here so I don't speak wrong. So yeah, half-elf, human, half-orc, halflings, gnomes, elves, and there's one for dwarves. Each mark will appear on a different race. Some marks will appear on multiple races, but generally it'll just be one race. So if you want to have a dragon mark, you have to be of that race, and part of your backstory will be you have to belong to that house, and basically, depending on the race, if you're human or half orc, the dragon mark acts as a variant race option for you. Half elf, it replaces some of your abilities, and then for things like halflings and gnomes and elves and dwarves, it actually replaces your sub race. So if you're an elf with a dragon mark, you are a dragon marked elf. You're not a high elf or a drow. You are a dragon marked elf. And I find that fascinating, especially with the kind of arguments I've seen online about how racial people are starting to question whether racial bonuses should be a thing, and I'm not going to get into that argument. But I really like the idea that these marks are so they alter you so much that you're basically a different kind of person. You're a complete separate, almost sub race of your race, and it ties you intrinsically to your house. And all of the dragon marks will have an ability you can use, like the mark of detection. It gives you the ability to do things like cast to detect magic. As you gain levels, you'll get see invisibility, and these are things that you can only use once per long rest. And then, if you're a spellcaster, you have an expanded spell list because of your mark. So there are more spells you have access to because you have a dragon mark. And they're really interesting. Each dragon mark page, I'll show you one here. You'll see each page just has a ton of info. Background on the mark itself, background on the house that the mark shows up in, and why that mark is associated with that house. It gives you your actual stats and things like that. They're really, really interesting. So I really love that. I love just how much more creative you can get using this dragon mark system. And I mentioned before that there are you can take a feat to get a dragon mark. Those are what are called aberrant dragon marks, and it's just what it says. The dragon marks are based on bloodline; they're genetic. But every so often, because they are magical, they will appear on someone that's in no way related to the bloodline. And they work a little bit different because feet versus race and all that stuff. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about how they work. Get the book if you want to know. But again, it's so interesting. And the as a DM, the kind of just tools they give you, like if you're playing in Eberron, use this system as is. It works fine. However, if you are creating your own world and want to add a dragon mark type system, whether you want it to be magical or genetic or mutation, like this gives you all the building blocks you need to create your own mark system. And it gives you two different ways you can implement it, whether via subrace or via feat. it is just a really interesting, robust way to change how D&D works without over complicating things, because as much as it adds more options for you, it uses already built-in systems in new ways, as opposed to just adding a new system which adds more rules and more complications. And that's really one of the things that made third edition kind of stagnate D&D itself, and it made fourth edition so complicated by the end. Is they just there's rules bloat. There was just so much complexity that started happening that no one could really follow everything, and you would have to have a dozen or so different books just to be able to play. So this, I think, is a really good way to introduce new customization options by simply modifying an already existing system, instead of adding a brand new system that you now have to change everything so that that system works with other things. They do add a new background. The house agent backgrounds are cool. Backgrounds are one of the easiest things for a DM to house house rule or homebrew. And even in the Adventurers League, you're allowed to create your own backgrounds. You can't create your own features. You have to pick a feature that already exists, but everything else you can create from scratch to create a custom character. So I love backgrounds, and I love them adding, more stuff to inspire you. But to me, new backgrounds are just, cool. They're not as groundbreaking as a new race or like this dragon mark system. And then after that, you have the Artificer. Now, I have done two different videos on the Artificer. I had the original Artificer, the revised Artificer, and now we have the officially released Artificer, which really isn't that much different than the revised one I did before, so I'm not going to do a full video on it. There's not really that much changing. I can say they have three subclasses. You have the Alchemist, Artillerist, and the Battlesmith, which all showed up in Unearthed Arcana. For the most part, they work the same way there as they do here. So it's not a huge change. It's just a refinement, and I like it. I really like it. I would let, in any of my campaigns, I would let someone play an Artificer, because I think they're really well made. And I think, again, it gives you a very different way to play. When I created my own custom class, the Dragon Knight, I did it because there wasn't a way to play that character. I couldn't create that character using current options. And so the Dragon Knight plays very different from everyone else. And the same is true about the Artificer. They're a very magic item focused class. They have a lot of cool things. They're very much tinkerers, and all of their subclasses give you very different experience. And I gotta say, my favorite is the Battlesmith, simply because it's this kind of melee warrior that you can go ranged, but the Battlesmith is kind of made for melee, specifically using like two-handed weapons in its core setting. I'm certain once I play with it and get to know it better, I can come up with some crazy variations on the Battlesmith. But the picture they have for the Battlesmith is this guy with his just big honking glowing hammer and armor, with a little metal dog with him. And it's so cool because it's a pet class, which again has had pretty bad results with the Beastmaster Ranger. This one is made really well, and it can be a pretty effective healer, and it has the ability to heal by bashing the bad guys. I think it's a really unique way to play a healer, because even a war cleric, which could take over healing duties, you kind of like every turn you kind of had to make the choice of, okay, am I going to war cleric and beat things, or am I going to heal people? And that's kind of how it's been in 5th edition, and the Battlesmith really lets you kind of do both at the same time. Obviously, if someone needs a big heal, you're still going to have to step back and do full-on healing. But it's a unique way to play that we haven't seen in 5th edition yet, and I love it. The final thing in chapter 1 is what's called group patrons, which I love. Group patrons are basically a way to give your players a reason to work together. As a DM, I know incentivizing the players to form a party and work together can be hard from an in-universe standpoint. Obviously, the players want to work together because that's how the game is played. But for their characters to work together, I've seen countless stories, and even have one of my own I'm not quite ready to share, where players have expressed, I don't really have a reason to adventure with these people other than I get paid every so often. The group patrons actually give them an active reason to work together. Some of the patrons are like an adventurers guild, a crime syndicate, a dragon marked house. Basically, one of these entities will kind of sponsor the team through monetary means, through a lot of different things. And by doing that, they have some incentives for the players to stay within their patrons' wishes. And again, it gives the players a reason to work together. And I absolutely love it. It goes just like the Adventurers Guild. It specifically mentions the Clifftop Adventurers Guild, which is an actual guild in Eberron. And it goes everything. It talks about their guild hall, their membership, how you become a member, who is a member. It talks about other guilds that are affiliated with this adventuring guild. And it's massive. And then it goes through benefits to being in the guild. It gives you some ideas on how to build the group. It gives some contacts that your guild or your party would have with the guild, which is really useful. And then it has a bunch of adventures that the guild might send you on. And then it also mentions a couple other adventuring guilds that either you might, your party might be involved with them instead of the Clifftop Adventures Guild, or their rival guild, and you run into them on certain missions and stuff. And this is all done in about 3-ish pages. They give you all this information. And it's brilliant because just that is the start of a campaign right there. You easily could run 5 levels worth of adventures just on the information you have right here and a monster manual. Like, that literally is all you need. And they actually have a bunch of monsters in this book. So it's a little bit limited compared to a full monster manual, but you literally could run a low-level campaign just from those 3-ish pages, and you have 11 different patrons in there. And again, just as before, this gives you the blueprints for making your own patrons. So again, if you're not running an Eberron, you can just take one of these guilds and move it to a different setting, or you can make your own group patron. And I love that. Again, it is a very common thing for dungeon masters to um, have to come up with some reason why the party stays together after the initial adventure, and that can be really difficult. But the longer the party plays together, the more they will just kind of gel with each other, and not the characters themselves will not want to split up. And I'm just really quick seeing if at the end of this, I totally missed something. Sorry. Just there we go. All right. So, yeah, I was just seeing if they actually had a blueprint for it. Here's your own how to make your own patron, and they don't have something explicitly, at least not that I've found. But again, if you just look at the patrons, you can build your own for an Eberron campaign if you don't want to use one of their pre-built ones for anything else. And that's what I love about this book, is there's just so much, and that's just the first chapter, which is the first roughly about 100 pages, is just that character creation goodness, and just tools for players, for DMs. It's really great. If that was all this book was, I would still consider it a solid purchase. It's not, though. Chapter 2 is what's called the Corvair Gazetteer, which is basically a newspaper. Corvair is the continent that the majority of Eberron is based in. That's the continent where the last war happened. There's another continent called Zendrix, I think it is. It starts with an X. I'm trying to see. They listed in here, and I can't find it. But anyway, that continent is mostly unsettled, uninhabited. That's your kind of, go into the unknown place, and it's really far away from Corvair. So once you get there, you kind of have to stay there until you want to spend, I can't remember if it's weeks or months, getting back to Corvair. So you have these kind of two different places. Corvair has a bunch of nations. They're all listed in here. Zendrick, that's what it's called. They mention some of the more distant lands in this chapter 2, but the whole thing is just a huge lore dump, and it goes for about 45 pages, and it's just chock full of everything you would need to start an adventure anywhere. A lot of people don't realize when they're making their own setting that the relationships between different cities, different nations, are as important as having a big baddie, or having some reason for the players to adventure. And by having strong ties and just kind of rules of etiquette and diplomacy already there, it gives the players that many more options as far as how to solve the problems they have to deal with. Everything from if they're in a situation where they have to break someone out of prison, which is not an uncommon thing to happen in a D&D game. They could go the secretive route, go in, break them out. They could go the diplomatic route of, just trying to negotiate their release, paying a fine, agreeing to community service. However, if there are rival nations or city states, you can go a completely different direction. Instead of trying to negotiate with the people that arrested him, who hold all the cards, you could go to another nation or city state, become friends with them or exploit a relationship with them, and get them to lean on the city state or city or whatever that has your friend captured or your target captured. And instead of going into the negotiations with them having a clear upper hand, you now have a much more equal negotiation field. Or it could be the exact opposite. And all of that comes from having established relationships between the different NPCs and cities and nations. And it gives your players so much more leeway in how they want to approach things, instead of just being murder hobos. And so that's what Chapter 2 really is. It's just giving you all this information about relationships and the background. It's really good. Chapter 3 is based entirely on one city, which is Sharn City of Towers. If you've never played Eberron, this city itself will feel kind of alien compared to anything in the Forgotten Realms. They don't really have a Sharn anywhere in the Forgotten Realms. And if you really want to, just kind of a visual idea of it, Sharn is Coruscant from this Star Wars universe. Sharn is this massive city that is full of towers. It looks very modern compared to everything else. They have skyscrapers and they have trains and things like that. They don't call them that. And it's all based on magic. But it's a brilliant place. Something that I don't think gets enough attention when people make campaigns, because they generally will make a campaign that you start in a small little village and then you get bigger and bigger, and eventually you're traveling all over the world to planes. That's what I've done in both my custom campaigns to a point. You actually can have an entire like level 1 to 20 campaign set in a single city, and it's a very different kind of campaign. It generally will involve a lot more interaction. There'll be a lot more intrigue and politics, and it's just a really fun thing to do. I've seen campaigns set entirely in Baldur's Gate. I've seen them set entirely in Waterdeep. A few in Neverwinter, but since the Sundering, it's not quite big enough for a campaign. Sharn is one of those cities where you could have a city campaign. It's massive. There's so much to it. They dedicate an entire chapter of about 30 pages just to Sharn and how it works. So it's a brilliant place. I have not read all of it. I just kind of skimmed through it, but it's really cool. Chapter 4 is what's called Building Eberron Adventures. Literally from page 183 to 260. So almost 100 pages. We're about 80 pages there. It's nothing but adventure hooks and ideas on how you could run an Eberron campaign. This is very much a DM focused chapter, and it's brilliant. I'm just going to open up to it real quick. What they'll do is they'll have like this is one start, where they will have cults of the dragon below, and they will describe kind of the basics. They give you a bunch of tables you can roll on to kind of customize it, and then they give you hooks. They will give you every so often, like the next section actually has maps in it. Like it's brilliant as far as how things are put in here. Every so often they have a section on the last war and how to run a campaign based around the last war. And the artwork is amazing. I think my favorite, and I want to see if I can find the artwork for it. Yes. So, this dude right here, he is called the Lord of Blades. He is, you could call him like the leader of the Warforged. He's not, but he's basically a Warforged that's kind of pissed that his entire race was built as slaves and weapons of war, and they never thought about what to do with them after the war was over. And so he's really upset about that, and so his entire purpose is to enact vengeance against the races that built the Warforged for doing something so monumentally stupid and calloused as creating an entire race with no purpose other than to be used as items, used as weapons. And that is such a cool idea. And I mentioned before, the Warforged themselves have this very interesting thing built into their race, which is my purpose is to be used by someone else to kill. Now that that's not happening, I have to come up with my own purpose with the fact that I was built and I'm designed for one thing. So if I want to do something outside of that, I have to use my own abilities and my own design to do things it was never supposed to do, like farming or raising a family. Things like that are things that Warforged were never designed with the ability to do. And so if that's what they want to do, they have to come up with strange ways to do it, and they have to come to grips with the idea that their entire purpose is to kill, and they can embrace that. They can fight against it. It's such an interesting idea, and a campaign based on the Lord of Blades really has to really gets to bring that up. And if you have the nice thing about it is you would think that would be, oh, that's a Warforged campaign, and yeah, you could have an entire party of Warforged that have to decide if they want to join the Lord of Blades or if they want to fight him or anything in between. However, it's just as impactful to have a mixture of races, some of which might have ancestors or might have been some of the people that helped to design Warforged, and they have to deal with the fact that their people created this race, and now they have to deal with everything that comes about from that. And so that's my personal favorite hook. But like I said, there's almost 100 pages of hooks. Each one goes for a page or two. They give you tons of options. And if you do complete one of the hooks, there's nothing stopping you from just going to another hook. Or you can create an entire 1 to 20 campaign, but based on that hook, depending on how creative you are. So yeah, chapter 4 is great. Chapter 5 is treasures. It's magic items. They do have some cool things, like they have a double blade, which is one of the things, one of the reasons I made my Dragon Knight, is one of these subclasses uses a double blade. They have, I think it's called a double scimitar is what they call it. Um, but yeah, I'm not going to go through all the different magic items. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. There's quite a few magic items that require a dragon mark to use. So again, you can kind of feed on that dragon mark system by having magic items that require dragon marks and interact with them in unique ways. Again, I love stuff like that. This is just more tools DM can use to get more interesting aspects of the game and more things than just, oh, look, this is a sword. You say a word and it goes on fire and does more damage. Well, yeah, that can be fun in combat, but a lot of these items you can use as story hooks. Um, oh, and they also have what are called dragon shards, which are basically they're magic stones. Uh, yeah, cool stuff. Then chapter 6 is friends and foes, which goes from 283 to 320, so about 40-ish pages, a little under. And that's just monsters. You know, there's stat blocks for everything from NPCs that you've already read about in the game to just generic monsters and stuff like that. You can throw at your players. Again, even if you're not playing an Eberron campaign, all of this stuff, monster manuals in general, are really useful for DMs because you can just take something like this, like living spells, or something I find really interesting because they quite literally are just a spell. Like one of them is living burning hands. It is literally a burning hands spell that has sentience that actually, you know, can interact on its own. And I love stuff like that. Do you need to be an Eberron for some freak magical experiment to go wrong and create a spell with a will of its own? No. And in fact, it could be a really cool plot point in any adventure, even if it's just a temporary one, or it could lead to an entire campaign where you know there's a wizard that's, you know, trying to create more powerful spells, but ends up just creating all these living spells. And after reading, they have 3 living spells they list there. They have living burning hands, living cloud kill, and living lightning bolt. However, if you look at these and you want a living spell campaign in your own world, it's as easy as look at how they took this spell and turned it into a monster, and then pick another spell. You want to know a really scary living spell to have? Living Wish. A campaign built around the idea that a wish spell was given sentience that could change reality every so often, and have access to every spell in existence. That would be such an interesting big bad guy for an end campaign, or just kind of their mere existence has caused trouble, but they're not, they don't have any malice, they're not trying to take over the world, but a wish spell with sentience breaks shit. I mean, it's the possibilities are endless, and that's just literally 3 monsters from the last, you know, 40 pages of the book have inspired an entire campaign. And that's what I love about this book, is there's so much here you can use to not only run an Eberron campaign, which, to be blunt, I'm excited about Eberron. I've never been a huge fan. I'm aware of Eberron. I've known about it for well over a decade. It's never been my thing. I've always been a high fantasy or Dark Sun was still is my favorite setting. And that's a very much desert survival wasteland, almost post-apocalyptic style thing, and I love that setting. Eberron has just never done it for me. I didn't dislike it or anything. I was just never, hooked by it. But this, I'm excited. I would love to play in an Eberron campaign. I'd love to run an Eberron campaign. However, unlike the Forgotten Realms, where I know it really well from just experiencing it for years and reading books set in it and knowing the lore and spending, I don't know, 4 years, 3 or 4 years running Adventures League content in it. Like, I know the Forgotten Realms really, really well. Eberron, I don't. So if I want to run a campaign in Eberron, I have to read basically this whole book and probably, check out an Eberron wiki or two just to get to the point where I feel comfortable enough to just go and be able to kind of improvise in that world and create my own aspects of it. But would I do that if I had players interested? Maybe. Right now, I'm really focused on fleshing out my own custom world and just getting it kind of set and the different aspects of it written down. But I would be game to run an Eberron campaign. So overall, my review of the book, it is brilliant. It is definitely, if you are a D&D player, I highly recommend pick up the book. They have an Eberron campaign for the D&D Adventures League. So even if you're just going to be a player, that's a really easy place that you can play. In general, most conventions are going to have some. If they have D&D at the convention, they're going to have Adventures League content. And more likely than not, they will at least have a couple tables running the Eberron campaign, which is going to be 20 adventures, 20 adventures. Each one, basically, you gain a level after it, and it will go 1 to 20 in Eberron. So if you want to play, I highly recommend pick up the book, because it will give you all the rules you need to build a character in Eberron, and it will give you so much lore you can use to make a really brilliant character. If you are a DM, you need this book. Even if you hate Eberron, the Dragon Marks system is brilliant. The Artificer is a great new class. Group patrons are wonderful. And all the little hooks they have specifically for Eberron, you can use in your own setting and just tweak some things. That Lord of Blades campaign, in my custom setting, there is a race that doesn't have an official name yet because I'm not pleased with the one I have, but they were literally created just like the Warforged as weapons during a thing called the Chosen War in my setting. So I literally could use that and just change the race. Nothing else has to change. And then, insert my own city names instead of theirs. Like, that's it. There's nothing else that would need to happen. So yeah, if you're a DM, get this book. If you're a player, highly recommend it. But DMs, I think, are going to get more out of this book than just a player. And if you're a player that's never thought about DM, pick up the book. This literally has everything you need to start DMing. The DM's guide is still a good thing to have. My book is starting to bow a little bit, which I'm not thrilled about. Um, but um, you literally could just pick up this one book and start running adventures without too much difficulty. The DM's guide does have some guidelines for things like building encounters and stuff that won't be in this book. But if you get what's called the Systems Reference Document, the SRD, it's free. You can download it directly from Wizards. That will have all, I think the last third of it is just the DM stuff. That'll have all the basics you would need. So literally just download that document, pick up this book, and start running. Your first campaign will probably be rough in places. I will almost guarantee it. But that's the whole point. Learn, experience. It'll make you a better DM. It'll make you a better player. My best players have always been DMs. So yeah. Now, there's a couple different ways to get this. Obviously, you can go to your friendly local game store and pick up this book, or you can get the alternate cover, which I love. It's gorgeous. I actually have alternate covers for one of my books. I'll show it to you here. Hold, please. Back up. This is, I believe, this is the only alternate cover I have, but this is Volo's Guide to Monsters. And you can see the alternate cover is just amazing. The regular cover looks a lot more like this art style, where it's got, D&D, and it's got the title in white and a little red line. The alternate covers are always gorgeous. So if you're going to get it and you have the option of getting the alternate cover, let me just move back. Do it. It's worth it. I think the book right now retails at $49.99. I will point out, this is not sponsored. I bought the book myself. I've no affiliation with Wizards. This is just as a D&D fan. But I believe it retails about $50. Yeah, you can get that from your store. You can also buy it online. That's where I bought mine, because I can't go to a games store. I bought this long before my anxiety and agoraphobia stopped me from leaving. I bought it on Amazon. I think I got it for $30. So I saved about $20. I had it next day because I've got Prime. And so if you want it quick, you don't have a game store near you, it's a great way to go. I always recommend support your local game stores if you can. It's a great way to get it. And then you can also buy the book through D&D Beyond and basically get a digital version of it. I have not seen the digital version of any of the books. The only thing I've bought from D&D Beyond were some stuff so I could build my one of my Adventure League characters. So I had to buy the Way of Shadow Monk and I think a feat or two just so I could build it in their character builder. But I haven't done anything outside of that. But it's only $30 on D&D Beyond. And it's digital. You can access it on your phone. You can access it on a computer, a tablet, anything with an internet connection. So in that realm, and then you can use like the Dragon Marks and the Artificer in their online character builder, which is a solid character builder. It's really good. So from that route, it's definitely cool. It's a way to save $20 and still get everything. It's searchable. So instead of like you saw me just going through and paging through it, You can just type a search and go for it. So all those things are really great. However, there's one thing that makes me kind of recommend the hardcover book over the digital version, and that is in the very back of the book. There is this. That is the world of Eberron, and on the other side, it has Corvair. This map is brilliant. They do have a map basically in the center of the book. It is nowhere near as detailed as this. This map is absolutely gorgeous. And if you're going to be running an Eberron campaign, this is a beautiful thing for when players sit down to have on the center of the table, so that everyone can see, okay, you're here. You might even go as far as getting it like a 5mm laminate just to protect the map itself. If you're going to use it kind of as a placemat, I would not go with a 10mm, because then it'd just be this giant like ID card, and that would be fun. But yeah, it'd be a brilliant way to just get everyone into the world by having the continent in front of them, and all the different cities and roads you can go on, and that all of that right there in front of them. I can tell you from personal experience, when I run games on Roll20, almost every game I run, the kind of just static map I have everyone on when we play is a map of the world or the location that they're in. So they can go, okay, where are we? We're here. Where do we want to go? We want to go here. We're going to take this route. So yeah, the map is worth paying a little bit extra to get the hardcover. And I personally, I like my hardcover books. When D&D Beyond goes defunct, which it will, I had, I can't remember what it was called, but I had a subscription to D&D that gave me access to basically all the 4th edition books digitally. I think I paid $10 a month. It was wonderful. You could custom build monsters. I literally spent hours in the character creator just building all these bizarre characters, and I had a blast. It was so much fun. That doesn't exist anymore. There's nowhere that you can do that, and that will happen to D&D Beyond eventually. Now, we're talking years, maybe decades down the road, depending on how long it takes for 6th edition to come out. But the digital stuff is digital. I like having my books. I do, because I can play. I have 4th edition books. I can run 4th edition games, despite the fact that the old thing I used to use for it doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. That's my review. Is a little bit long, took an hour, but it's a 300 to 20 page book, and I've spent hours on like 10 pages of the PHB. So I think I made a pretty good time. Again, highly recommend you pick up the book. I think it's worth the $50. It's definitely worth the 30 I paid for it. The map is gorgeous. The artwork is amazing. The new character creation options are phenomenal. All the DM stuff and the history and lore in here is amazing. You can literally just sit down and read the book. You don't actually have to use it as a DM supplement. You can just read entire parts of it just as a story, and it's still fun. So anyway, that's all for me today, and I'll see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.